The Banthy afternoon sun hung low over the sleepy town of Willow Springs, its golden light washing across the faded rooftops, the cracked sidewalks, and the dusty road that stretched toward the Carter family's modest farmhouse. The old wooden porch creaked as Evelyn Carter stood there gripping the railing, her hands trembling ever so slightly. She had just finished reading the letter her son Daniel had sent, or rather, the letter Isabella had written in his name. Her heart felt like it had been torn in two. The words were still sharp in her mind. "You are not welcome at the wedding. It is better if you stay away." These words were written in elegant handwriting, cold and merciless, and at the bottom, Daniel's signature, forced or willing. She could not tell, but to Evelyn it was a knife twisting deep. For 30 long years she had poured her soul into raising Daniel. She had worked the farm when her husband passed away in an accident. She had milked cows before dawn, gathered eggs with blistered hands, and taken small cleaning jobs in town just to make sure Daniel had shoes for school. She had taught him to ride a bicycle on that same dirt road, patched up his knees when he fell, and prayed beside him when nights grew heavy with loneliness. Now, after all that sacrifice, she was being told she was not family. Evelyn's knees weakened and she sank into the rocking chair, the letter slipping from her fingers. Her eyes blurred with tears, but she would not cry loudly. She had learned to cry silently in the stillness of the night so her boy would not hear. Her mind wandered back to when Daniel first introduced Isabella, the young woman with polished shoes, a designer purse, and a gaze that measured everyone in the room. Isabella had smiled politely, but there was something behind her eyes, something that made Evelyn uneasy. She had tried to brush it off, convincing herself that perhaps she was just protective of her only son, but the signs had been there. The way Isabella wrinkled her nose at the farm animals, the way she corrected Daniel in front of others, the way she sighed whenever Evelyn spoke about simple things like sewing or gardening. Still, Evelyn had tried to welcome her. She had baked pies, invited her to Sunday dinners, and even gifted her a quilt she had sewn with her own hands. Isabella accepted it with a tight smile, but Evelyn later noticed the quilt folded carelessly in the back seat of Daniel's car. Forgotten. The town knew of the Hayes family. Isabella's parents, wealthy landowners who owned half the real estate downtown. They walked with their heads high, their words often laced with disdain for those who worked with their hands. Evelyn was nothing but a widow with a small farm. In their eyes she was beneath notice. Now it was all clear. Isabella had never wanted her around. And Daniel, her sweet boy, had chosen silence. The pain settled deep, heavier than any bale of hay Evelyn had ever carried. But pain often lit a fire in her. Evelyn was not a woman who bowed easily. She had lived too many hard winters, too many seasons of hunger. She straightened her shoulders and whispered to herself, "If they think they can erase me, they are wrong." That night the farmhouse was quiet. Only the ticking of the old clock and the wind rattling against the windows filled the air. Evelyn sat at the kitchen table staring at the worn photograph of Daniel as a child, his little hand holding hers, his eyes bright with trust. She traced his face with her fingertip, her heart aching when the phone rang. She almost did not answer, but it was her neighbor Clara. Clara had heard the whispers in town. People talked, and news of Evelyn's exclusion had spread faster than wildfire. Clara spoke gently. "Evelyn, is it true they said you are not invited?" Evelyn swallowed hard, her throat dry. "Yes, Clara, it is true. I'm not welcome." Clara sighed. "I don't know what kind of woman bans a mother from her own son's wedding. It is not right." "Not right," Evelyn repeated softly, her voice trembling. She hung up the phone and walked outside. The night was dark, the stars scattered across the sky. She had once told Daniel that stars were like promises, constant and unchanging. Now she wondered if promises could also fade. The wedding was only weeks away. The barn at Miller's farm had been booked, the decorations chosen, the honeymoon fund collected. Everyone was preparing for a grand celebration, except her. Evelyn clenched her fists. She had no intention of simply sitting by. She would go to that wedding, invited or not. She would stand in the back if she had to. She would not let them erase her from her son's life so easily. The days passed slowly, each one heavier than the last. The farm work gave her no peace. Every chicken fed, every fence mended, every row of corn checked. All of it felt empty without Daniel's laughter nearby. Then came the morning she saw him. Daniel, driving up in his black truck, his hair neatly combed, his shirt freshly pressed. He looked older, more polished, more distant. Evelyn's heart leapt. She wanted to hug him, to hold him, to beg him to explain. But his eyes told her he had already chosen his side. "Mother," he said softly, "I came to talk." Evelyn's hands trembled as she motioned him inside. They sat across from each other at the old wooden table. the same table where Evelyn once taught him to write his name. Daniel cleared his throat. Mother, I need you to understand. Isabella wants the wedding to be simple, without drama. She believes it would be better if you didn't come. Evelyn's chest tightened, she whispered. And what do you believe? Daniel, he looked away, his silence louder than any words. Evelyn felt her heart splinter. She forced herself to breathe, to keep her voice steady. So you will marry her, and in doing so you will cut me out. Daniel's lips parted. He looked pained. Mother, it's not like that. I love you, but I also love her. I need to keep the peace, Evelyn repeated bitterly, by betraying your own blood. Daniel flinched. He stood abruptly. I should go. Evelyn rose too, her voice rising for the first time. You can walk away from me today, Daniel, but remember this. When storms come, when masks fall, you will remember who stood by you when no one else would. Daniel froze in the doorway, his eyes wet, but he said nothing. He stepped outside, leaving Evelyn standing alone in the silence. The sound of his truck faded into the distance, and with it the last thread of her patience snapped. She looked at the wedding invitation lying on the counter, bold and beautiful, her name absent from the list. She picked it up, her hands shaking. She took a red marker from the drawer and drew a single line across it. A crimson cross, sharp and final. Her whisper echoed in the empty room. If they want to ban me, then they will learn what it means to push away a mother. And with that vow, Evelyn's story of quiet strength and hidden resolve truly began. The red cross on the invitation. The morning after Daniel left her farmhouse, Evelyn sat at the kitchen table staring at the invitation that still bore the thick red cross she had drawn across it the night before. The mark glared back at her, bold and unyielding, a reflection of the storm brewing within her heart. She tried to busy herself with chores, but the weight of betrayal followed her into every room and every field. The eggs she gathered from the hens that morning felt heavier than usual, as though each one carried the disappointment of her son's silence. The cows lowed restlessly in the barn, sensing the agitation in their caretaker. Even the old farmhouse dog, a loyal mutt named Jasper, sat by her feet with his ears drooping as if he too knew something in their small world had fractured beyond easy repair. Evelyn had endured many hardships in her life, but the idea of being erased from her only child's wedding cut deeper than any loss she had known before. Her mind drifted back to the years when Daniel was still a boy. She remembered how he used to sit at that same table, swinging his little legs while waiting for her to serve cornbread fresh from the oven. He would chatter about school, about the dreams he had of becoming someone who could build great machines, someone who could leave the farm and see the world. She had always encouraged him, even when her heart ached at the thought of being left behind. She had sacrificed every dream of her own so that he could have his. She had gone without new shoes, without decent clothes so he could wear crisp uniforms to school. She had taken extra shifts cleaning offices at night, her back aching and her lungs heavy with dust so he could have books, supplies, and later, the chance to attend college. She had never once begrudged him those sacrifices because in her heart, it was her duty and her joy to see her son rise above the life she had known. And now, the very son she raised with that kind of devotion was standing silent while a woman he had known only a few short years pushed her out of the most important day of his life. The town's whispers grew louder each passing day. Willow Springs was not a big place, and news spread faster than the summer storms. At the general store, Evelyn could feel eyes following her as she picked up flour and coffee. Women standing near the canned goods lowered their voices, but not their gaze. She could hear fragments of their gossip. Did you hear? Isabella told her not to come, said she would ruin the photographs. Another woman, her voice tinged with pity, replied, Poor Evelyn, after all she did for that boy. Evelyn forced herself to stand tall, her face betraying none of the hurt that pounded inside her chest. She was not one to crumble in front of others. Still, when she returned to her truck and shut the door, her hands shook as she gripped the steering wheel, the shame pressing against her ribs like a physical weight. Clara, her neighbor and friend, came by later that evening. She found Evelyn sitting on the porch with the red-crossed invitation still in her lap. Clara was a sturdy woman, with kind eyes that had seen more than her share of hardship as well, and she spoke with a frankness that often cut straight to the truth. Evelyn, she said gently, lowering herself into the chair beside her, you can't let them break you like this. I've known you too long. You're stronger than any of them know. Evelyn sighed deeply, her voice heavy with weariness. Strength doesn't mean much when your own son won't lift a word to defend you. I raised him, Clara. I gave him everything I had, and now I am being treated like I am nothing. Do you know what it feels like to be told you are not family by your own child's bride? Clara's eyes softened. Yes, I do know in my own way. But I also know something else. That girl may think she has power because she has money, but she doesn't know the kind of power you carry. The kind that comes from years of sacrifice, from walking through fire and still standing. Don't let her write you out of this story, Evelyn. You are still his mother, no matter what she says. Those words lingered with Evelyn long into the night. She sat alone at the table, the house quiet except for the creak of the old wood beams. She thought about the venue, the barn at Miller's farm, which she had helped secure months ago with her own hidden savings. Daniel and Isabella believed that Isabella's family had handled the entire expense. But in truth, Evelyn had quietly paid the deposit long before, wanting to contribute something meaningful without embarrassing her son in front of his wealthy fiancé. She thought too of the honeymoon fund, the account she had been managing for years, setting aside bits of her meager income to ensure her son's future joy. She had told Daniel it was only a small gift, but in truth, she had nearly emptied her own savings to make sure his honeymoon would be something unforgettable. They did not know. Isabella did not know. Daniel had never asked. He had simply accepted it as one of life's small blessings. As Evelyn sat there remembering all these things, the ache inside her heart began to shift. What had once been raw pain slowly hardened into a kind of resolve. She thought of the red cross she had drawn over the invitation, and she realized that maybe it had not been just a symbol of rejection. Perhaps it was also a mark of power, her declaration that she would not be erased so easily. They might bar her from the ceremony, but they did not yet realize how much of it rested in her hands. The days leading up to the wedding were filled with constant reminders of her exclusion. Trucks passed by carrying flowers and supplies for the barn. The church bells rang with extra rehearsals as if mocking her absence. Daniel did not come by again, and his silence was louder than any argument. Still, Evelyn moved with quiet determination, her plan beginning to take shape. She visited the bank, her steps slow but deliberate. The teller, a young man who had grown up in the town, greeted her politely. Evelyn asked to review the honeymoon account. When she saw the numbers on the page, a bittersweet pride filled her chest. It was a large sum, more than she ever imagined she could have saved. She thought of all the long nights she had worked, the hours she had spent scrubbing floors while her body begged for rest, the meals she had skipped so she could tuck a little extra away for him. All of it sat there in neat black digits, and all of it could vanish with the stroke of a pen if she wished. She left the bank that day with her heart pounding, knowing she held in her hands a kind of power neither Isabella nor her wealthy parents had considered. Power not born of money inherited or status claimed, but of love, sacrifice, and endurance. She also stopped by the Miller farm. The old barn stood tall, its wood weathered but sturdy, decorated with lights and ribbons as workers moved in and out preparing for the big day. Evelyn spoke quietly with Mr. Miller, whose family had known hers for decades. Their conversation was brief, but when she walked back to her truck, her face was set with a quiet determination that none of the town's gossipers could have imagined. That night, Evelyn returned home and placed the invitation with the red cross in a small wooden box, where she kept keepsakes of Daniel's childhood. His first report card, the little clay bird he had made for her in elementary school, the photograph of him in his graduation gown. She looked at them all, tears burning her eyes, and whispered to the silence, "They will not take you from me. They may think they can, but they will not." Jasper whined softly at her feet as if in agreement. The eve of the wedding arrived with heavy clouds rolling in from the horizon. Evelyn stood on her porch watching the sky darken, her thoughts swirling with memories, regrets, and plans. She did not know what tomorrow would bring, but she knew one thing with absolute certainty. She would not be the silent, forgotten mother left behind. She had been pushed too far, and now, for the first time in years, the quiet woman of Willow Springs felt a storm rising inside her that could no longer be contained. And as the first drops of rain began to fall, Evelyn whispered to herself the promise that would change everything. If they will not let me in with love, then they will learn what it means to lock me out. The painful confrontation. The morning of the rehearsal arrived with a gray sky that seemed to mirror Evelyn's heart. She woke early, as she always did, her body still trained by years of farm work. But this morning the chores did little to steady her. She fed the chickens, milked the cows, and moved through the familiar rhythm of her duties, yet each action felt hollow, stripped of the peace it once gave her. By mid-morning, her restlessness drove her into the old truck, the same one she had driven since Daniel was in high school, its paint chipped and its engine grumbling. She told herself she only wanted to pass by the Miller barn to see the preparations, to catch a glimpse of the joy her son was meant to be part of. But deep down she knew she wanted more. She wanted to see Daniel's face, to search for any trace of the boy who had once clung to her hand at church picnics and promised he would always take care of her. As the truck rattled down the dirt road, Evelyn's stomach tightened. Already she could see cars lined up outside the barn, sleek vehicles belonging to the Hayes family and their wealthy friends. Workers moved briskly in and out of the barn doors carrying flower arrangements, cases of wine, and crates of polished glassware. The barn, which had always smelled of hay and livestock, had been transformed into a dazzling venue. Strings of fairy lights were being tested overhead, glowing softly against the weathered wood. Evelyn pulled her truck to the side and sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel, her knuckles white. She told herself she had a right to be there, not as a guest, not as someone who needed permission, but as Daniel's mother. Her presence was justified by every sleepless night she had worked to keep food on the table, every prayer she had whispered for his safety, every tear she had swallowed so he would never see her weakness. When she finally stepped out, her boots crunching on the gravel, a few heads turned. Workers paused in their tasks, their eyes flicking between her and the barn, as though they already sensed tension in the air. Evelyn ignored them and walked toward the entrance, her heart pounding with each step. She reached the wide barn doors, and before she could take another step inside, a sharp voice cut through the air. "Evelyn." The voice belonged to Isabella, standing tall in a fitted dress that looked out of place for a rehearsal, but matched perfectly with her air of authority. Her arms were crossed, her lips pressed into a thin line, and her eyes burned with the cold fire of someone who knew she held the upper hand. Behind her, Daniel stood, his posture tense, his eyes darting nervously between his mother and his fiancée. Evelyn's chest ached at the sight of him. He looked handsome, his hair neatly styled, his shirt crisp, but his expression was not his own. It was guarded, restrained, as though he were caught in invisible chains. Evelyn forced herself to keep her voice steady as she said, "I came to see my son, to see where he will be married." Isabella's lips curved into a smile that carried no warmth. "We've already discussed this. You are not welcome here. This is not your place." The words hit Evelyn like a slap. She straightened her shoulders, lifting her chin, refusing to let the pain show. "Not my place? I carried him for 9 months. I raised him when his father left. I worked until my body broke so he could stand here today. If this is not my place, then what place do I have?" A hush fell over the barn. Workers pretended to busy themselves, but their ears strained for every word. Even the music rehearsal halted as the pianist froze mid-note. Isabella did not flinch. "This wedding is about Daniel and me, not about your sacrifices. You always remind everyone what you did, as if you deserve endless gratitude. But sometimes, Evelyn, love means knowing when to step aside. This day belongs to us, and your presence will only create embarrassment. I will not allow that." Evelyn's hands trembled at her sides, not from fear but from fury held tightly in check. Her eyes burned as she turned to Daniel, her voice cracking. "Daniel, are you going to stand there and say nothing? Are you going to let her speak to me this way? Am I so easily erased from your life?" Daniel shifted uncomfortably, his face pale. He opened his mouth, closed it, then finally muttered, "Mother, please don't make this harder. Isabella's right. This is not the time." The words crushed her more than any insult Isabella could hurl. They were not cruel, but they carried the weight of surrender, a quiet betrayal that pierced her heart. Evelyn's vision blurred as tears welled, though she fought to keep them from falling. She had promised herself long ago that she would not cry in front of those who sought to belittle her. She drew in a long breath and steadied herself, her voice low but sharp as steel. "I am not making this harder, Daniel. I am only reminding you of the truth, a truth you seem too blind to see right now. One day when the veil is lifted, you will remember this moment and regret it." Silence thickened around them. Even Isabella seemed momentarily unsettled by the quiet intensity of Evelyn's words, but then she recovered, stepping forward with that same dismissive smile. "You see? This is why you cannot be here. Always dramatic, always clinging to the past. Daniel and I are building a future, and in that future there is no place for bitterness. so please leave before you embarrass yourself further." Evelyn looked at her son one last time, her heart screaming for him to stand up, to choose her, to say something that would mend the wound splitting her soul apart. But Daniel lowered his gaze, unable to meet her eyes. That was the answer, and it shattered her more completely than words ever could. She turned slowly, her boots heavy against the gravel, and walked back to her truck. The whispers followed her like shadows. Workers murmured. Guests exchanged uneasy glances, but no one dared to speak aloud. Evelyn climbed into her old truck, her fingers trembling as she gripped the steering wheel. Her chest heaved, but she refused to break down until she was away from their prying eyes. As the truck rumbled down the dirt road, Evelyn felt a fire ignite inside her, stronger than anything she had ever known. The humiliation burned, yes, but it also gave her clarity. She had been cast aside publicly, made to look like an outsider in her own son's life. But what they did not know, what Isabella could not possibly imagine, was that the very foundation of this wedding rested on Evelyn's sacrifices. The venue, the honeymoon fund, the small but essential threads holding this event together, all of it existed because of her. Her humiliation had been public, but her response would be quiet, measured, and devastating. She would not shout, she would not beg, and she would not plead for entry into their world. Instead, she would remind them, in her own way, that you cannot cut out a mother's place in her child's life without consequences. By the time she pulled into her driveway, the storm clouds above had begun to thicken, their weight pressing down on the small farmhouse like a warning. Evelyn sat in the truck for a long time, staring at the horizon, her heart still raw from Daniel's silence. But beneath the pain, a new resolve grew stronger by the second. She would not forget the look on Isabella's face, the dismissive tilt of her head, the cold fire in her eyes. That image would fuel her in the days to come. She whispered to herself, her voice steady despite the tears threatening to fall. "You think you've won, Isabella Hayes, but you have no idea who you are dealing with." And with that vow, Evelyn stepped out of the truck, ready to embrace the storm brewing both in the skies above and in her own soul. The silent revenge, the humiliation of the confrontation at the Miller barn lingered like a fresh wound in Evelyn's heart. But instead of leaving her broken, it hardened her spirit. She spent the night tossing in her bed, staring at the cracked ceiling of the farmhouse, listening to the restless groan of the wind outside. Every word Isabella had spoken echoed in her mind, sharp and unforgiving, and worse than that was Daniel's silence, his inability to speak in her defense, his refusal to look her in the eye as she walked away. Yet where some women might have collapsed under the weight of rejection, Evelyn found herself growing colder, clearer, and stronger with every passing hour. By dawn, she was no longer a mother desperate to be included. She was a woman who had been pushed too far, and she knew exactly where to strike back. She moved through her chores that morning with mechanical efficiency. She gathered eggs, her fingers swift and steady. Though her mind burned with purpose, she milked the cows, the rhythmic sound of the streams into the metal pail grounding her in routine, even as her thoughts planned for what was to come. The farm had taught her patience, discipline, and timing, lessons she would now turn against those who thought her powerless. By the time she poured herself a cup of bitter black coffee at the kitchen table, she already knew what she was going to do. Her first stop was the bank. She dressed plainly as always, wearing her faded jeans and flannel shirt, her boots scuffed from years of work, but she walked into that building with the bearing of a queen. The bank manager, a man who had known her for decades, greeted her politely, though she could see the flicker of curiosity in his eyes. Evelyn was not a woman who made sudden visits without reason. She asked to speak privately, and when the door to his office closed behind them, she slid the paperwork across the desk and quietly explained her decision. The honeymoon account, the one she had secretly funded for years, was hers to control, and she would be freezing it effective immediately. She explained nothing further, offering no justification, no hint of the betrayal that had driven her to this choice. She simply signed her name with steady hands, the same hands that had scrubbed floors and picked crops so that account could exist. When she left the bank, the weight on her chest felt lighter. A part of her wanted to cry, because the fund had been her gift of love, her sacrifice for Daniel's happiness. But she swallowed the tears. Love had been met with dismissal, and so sacrifice would now be replaced by silence. Her next step took her to the Miller farm. The barn stood tall in the distance, still draped in lights and ribbons, though preparations had slowed with the storm clouds hanging overhead. Mr. Miller himself greeted her, wiping his hands on his overalls, his face a mixture of surprise and concern. Evelyn had known his family for years. They had grown up in the same town, faced the same hardships, celebrated the same county fairs. He respected her, and he listened carefully as she explained in calm, measured words that she would be withdrawing her support for the event. The deposit she had placed months ago, the one no one else knew about, would no longer be extended. She asked him to cancel the booking effective immediately. Mr. Miller hesitated, his brow furrowed. "Evelyn, are you certain? This will cause a storm and folks will know it came from you." She looked him squarely in the eye, her voice firm. "Let them think what they want. I am not welcome there. Why should my money, my work, my sacrifices build a celebration I have been barred from?" He nodded slowly, the weight of her decision settling between them. He did not argue further. He had seen her endure too much to doubt her resolve now. With a heavy sigh, he agreed, and by the time she climbed back into her truck, the arrangements for the barn were unraveling behind her. The venue that had been the Hayes family's pride, the stage for their grand display of wealth and power, was slipping through their fingers, and they had no idea it was Evelyn's hand that had pulled the thread loose. That evening, Evelyn sat on her porch watching the storm roll across the fields. The wind whipped through the trees, bending them low, the rain lashing against the old boards of the house. She sipped tea slowly, her face illuminated by the occasional flash of lightning, her expression calm but unyielding. In the distance, she imagined the chaos that must be erupting in the Hayes household as they scrambled to salvage their plans, unaware of how deep her quiet reach extended. But revenge was not what Evelyn told herself this was about. No, she reminded herself, this was about dignity. This was about making sure that her years of sacrifice were not treated like dirt beneath Isabella's polished shoes. She would not allow them to erase her so easily. If they wanted to pretend she had no place, then she would show them what life looked like, without the invisible scaffolding she had built beneath their celebration. The days that followed were filled with whispers. The town, already abuzz with talk of her exclusion, now caught wind of the unraveling plans. Rumors spread like wildfire. Some said the barn had been double booked. Others whispered that the Hayes family had failed to pay their share. Few knew the truth, but many suspected Evelyn's hand was in it. She ignored the gossip, carrying herself with quiet grace, her head held high when she walked into the general store or past neighbors on the road. Inside, her heart still ached for Daniel, but she hardened herself against the weakness of longing. She told herself that he had made his choice, and now he would learn that choices carried consequences. Daniel came by once during that week, his truck pulling up the familiar drive. Evelyn met him at the porch, her arms crossed. His face was drawn, worry etched into every line. "Mother," he began, his voice low. "Something's happening with the wedding plans. The barn has been canceled, and the honeymoon fund." He paused as though the words were too heavy. "It's gone. They said it was frozen. Did you know anything about this?" Evelyn studied him carefully, her eyes steady. She wanted to soften, to reach out and comfort him. But then she remembered Isabella's voice, sharp and cold, saying she was not welcome, that she had no place. She remembered Daniel's silence as she was humiliated. So she kept her tone measured even. Some things in life, Daniel, are not guaranteed. Sometimes we forget who makes sacrifices until they stop being made. His face twisted with confusion, perhaps even guilt. But before he could press her further, Isabella appeared beside him, stepping out of the truck in her pristine dress and heels. Her expression hardened when she saw Evelyn, her eyes narrowing. "So it is you. I should have known. You're trying to ruin this wedding." Evelyn did not flinch. She stood tall, her voice calm. "I am not ruining anything. I am simply withdrawing what I gave. If you do not want me, then you do not get what I bring. It is as simple as that." Isabella's face flushed with anger, but Evelyn turned away before she could respond. She walked back into her house, closing the door firmly behind her, leaving her son and his fiancée standing in the rain, their carefully constructed world beginning to crumble. Inside, Evelyn leaned against the door, her breath unsteady, her heart pounding. She hated that she had to hurt Daniel to make her point, but she also knew that this was not just about him anymore. It was about her dignity, her place, her worth as a mother who had given everything. For too long she had been silent, patient, and selfless. Now for once in her life she was claiming the power her sacrifices had earned her. As thunder rolled across the horizon, Evelyn whispered to herself, "Let them see what happens when they try to erase me. Let them see the storm they have called down." And in that moment she knew there was no turning back. The fallout. The morning of the wedding dawned heavy with humidity and tension, the air thick as though the very earth sensed the storm about to unfold. Evelyn rose before the sun, her body moving through the familiar rituals of farm life, though her heart was elsewhere. She collected eggs from the henhouse, her hand steady despite the turmoil she knew would unfold in town that day. As she poured feed for the cows, she imagined the frantic scrambling that must already be erupting among the Hayes family. She had heard through whispers in the store and Clara's careful hints that the barn was no longer available, and that no suitable replacement had been secured in time. The entire event, carefully planned to project wealth and perfection, was collapsing in the most public way possible. Evelyn neither smiled nor gloated as she thought of it. Her heart was too heavy for joy. This was not triumph, she reminded herself. It was consequence. By mid-morning, the telephone rang. Evelyn paused, drying her hands on her apron before answering. It was Clara, her voice breathless with excitement. "Evelyn, you won't believe it. The Hayes family is in uproar. Guests have arrived from out of town and found there's no place to gather. They're calling every hall, every church, every barn, and it's all too late. Word is spreading faster than wildfire." Evelyn listened in silence, her face expressionless as Clara continued. "And that's not all. The honeymoon plans, people are whispering that the fund has disappeared. Isabella is furious and Daniel looks like a man about to break in half." Evelyn thanked her friend calmly and hung up the phone. She walked to the window, staring out at the fields bathed in the rising sun, her mind a storm of conflicting emotions. She had wanted dignity, not spectacle, yet now the entire town was buzzing, and her son's wedding was unraveling under the weight of secrets they had never considered. At the Hayes mansion, chaos reigned. The grand foyer, usually a place of polished order, was filled with angry voices, clattering footsteps, and the shrill demands of Isabella herself. She paced back and forth, her perfectly styled hair now disheveled, her face flushed with rage. How could this happen? She snapped, her voice echoing off the marble walls. "We are the Hayes family. Do you understand? This is not some farmer's gathering. This is supposed to be the event of the year." Her parents tried to soothe her, their own pride stung by the humiliation of failed arrangements, but Isabella would not be calmed. She turned on Daniel, her eyes blazing. "This is your mother's doing, I know it. She is trying to ruin us." Daniel stood near the staircase, his tie hanging loose around his neck, his face pale and drawn. He rubbed his temples, exhausted. Deep inside he knew Isabella was right. He had seen the look in his mother's eyes when she spoke of sacrifices forgotten. He had heard the steel in her voice when she told him that choices had consequences. But admitting that truth aloud meant admitting his own guilt, that he had failed to defend her, failed to honor the woman who had given him everything. He remained silent, torn between loyalty to the woman he loved and the shame of betraying the mother who had raised him. Guests began arriving, dressed in their finest, expecting a lavish barn celebration, only to be greeted by confusion and hurried explanations. The Miller barn was locked, the decorations stripped away, the lights unplugged. A hastily arranged plan to use the church hall fell apart when the pastor refused, stating that the hall was already booked for another event. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, whispers of scandal, of disrespect, of something darker at play. Some guests cast sympathetic glances toward Daniel. Others raised their brows at Isabella, whose fury only grew under the weight of judgmental eyes. By noon, the entire wedding was in disarray. The florist had pulled back their services, unwilling to deliver to a non-existent venue. The caterer had canceled, claiming they had not received final payment. Even the band, sensing trouble, quietly excused themselves, unwilling to risk entanglement in what was quickly becoming the most talked-about disaster Willow Springs had ever seen. The Hayes family, so used to controlling the narrative, could do nothing to stop the tide of humiliation. Their pride had blinded them, and now they stood exposed before the very community they had once looked down upon. Back at her farmhouse, Evelyn sat quietly at the kitchen table, her hands folded in her lap, listening to the distant rumble of thunder. Jasper lay at her feet, his ears twitching at every sound, sensing his mistress's unrest. Evelyn's heart ached for Daniel. She imagined his face, the confusion and shame in his eyes, the weight of watching his carefully planned future collapse around him. She wanted to reach for him, to comfort him, to take away the pain. But she reminded herself again and again that he had chosen this path, that he had stood silent when she was cast out. Sometimes she thought bitterly, a mother must allow her child to stumble in order to learn the value of what they have lost. As afternoon turned to evening, the storm clouds gathered thick above the town. At the Hayes home, where the remnants of the wedding guests now gathered awkwardly in cramped rooms, voices rose in anger. Isabella cornered Daniel, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "You fix this," she hissed. "You go to your mother and make her undo whatever she has done. Do you hear me? If you don't, then we have nothing. No wedding, no future. You choose her or me, Daniel. Right now." The word struck him like a blow. He looked at Isabella, the woman he thought he loved. And then he remembered his mother's voice at the barn, steady and unwavering, reminding him that one day he would regret the silence he had chosen. He felt that regret now burning in his chest like fire. He realized in that moment that love built on control was no love at all, and respect denied to one's mother was a wound that could never heal. He wanted to speak, to stand tall, but the weight of the day held him frozen. Isabella's eyes blazed, her parents glared, and the guests watched in thinly veiled judgment. At the farmhouse, Clara came to visit as dusk settled. She found Evelyn sitting by the window, her face lit by the soft glow of a kerosene lamp. Clara shook her head in disbelief. "Evelyn, the whole town is talking. They say the Hayes family is finished." People saw Isabella screaming at Daniel, saw guests walking out in disgust. "It's like the mighty have fallen." Evelyn turned her gaze from the window, her voice calm, almost sorrowful. "Clara, this was never about destroying them. It was about showing them that I am not invisible. They thought they could take everything I gave and still cast me aside. Now they see what happens when the hands that build are withdrawn." Clara studied her friend, both in awe and in concern. "And Daniel?" she asked softly. Evelyn's eyes glistened, though no tears fell. "Daniel must learn. Pain is a cruel teacher, but sometimes it is the only one that leaves a lesson carved deep enough to last." As night fell, the storm finally broke, rain lashing against the Hayes mansion as though the heavens themselves had joined the reckoning. Inside, Daniel sat alone in a corner, his tie undone, his dreams shattered. Isabella raged on, her voice shrill, but he no longer listened. His thoughts were far away, back in the farmhouse where his mother's steady hands once guided his, where love had never demanded conditions, where sacrifice had always been given freely. And for the first time since the chaos began, Daniel felt the crushing weight of realization. He had chosen wrong, and now the cost of that choice lay before him in ruins. The shattered illusion. The day after the wedding disaster, Willow Springs was alive with gossip. At the general store, whispers circled faster than the summer flies. At the diner, farmers leaned across tables to trade versions of what they had heard. At church, the murmurs between hymns carried the same refrain, that the Hayes wedding had collapsed in spectacular fashion, leaving behind nothing but humiliation and unanswered questions. In every version of the tale, Isabella's anger was a centerpiece, her voice echoing in the minds of those who had witnessed her shrill demands. Daniel, once admired as the hard-working son of a resilient widow, was now pitied, his reputation bruised by his silence and his choice of bride. Evelyn heard these whispers too, but she did not let them fuel her pride. She moved through town with her usual quiet dignity, buying feed for her animals, picking up supplies, offering polite greetings to neighbors who now regarded her with a mix of awe and sympathy. She carried herself as though nothing had changed, but inside, her heart wrestled with pain and sorrow. She had proven her worth, but in doing so, she had watched her son crumble under the weight of choices he was not strong enough to defend. At the Hayes mansion, the aftermath was far less composed. The grand house, which had once been the stage for polished dinners and glittering parties, now echoed with sharp words and cold silences. Isabella stormed from room to room, hurling accusations at Daniel, at her parents, at the very fabric of the town that dared whisper about her downfall. She accused Daniel of weakness, of failing to control his mother, of allowing their lives to be ruined by what she called a bitter old woman's jealousy. Her words were venomous, but Daniel no longer flinched. He sat at the edge of the bed in the room they were meant to share as newlyweds, his hands clasped, his gaze distant. He thought of the farmhouse, of evenings spent watching his mother mend clothes by the firelight, of mornings where she woke him with the smell of biscuits even after working late into the night. He thought of the barn, of the silence that followed when his mother asked him if he would truly erase her from his life, and of the shame he had felt as he stood frozen while Isabella dismissed her. That shame had only deepened as he watched his wedding collapse, not from chance or bad luck, but from the withdrawal of the very sacrifices his mother had made in secret. It was then that the truth struck him with full force. The barn had been secured not by Isabella's wealthy family, but by Evelyn, quietly, humbly, without ever asking for recognition. The honeymoon fund, the dream he had assumed came from the generosity of the Hayes, had been built by his mother's calloused hands and long nights of endless work. She had given him gifts greater than any wealth could purchase, and he had allowed those gifts to be spat upon. He had chosen to remain silent when he should have spoken, blind when he should have seen, cowardly when he should have been strong. The weight of it crushed him, and he felt as though the walls of the mansion were closing in. When Isabella entered the room again, her voice sharp and unrelenting, Daniel finally looked at her with new eyes. He saw not the polished woman who had once dazzled him with her sophistication, but a stranger whose heart was as cold as the marble floors beneath their feet. She sneered at him, demanding he confront his mother and force her to reinstate the funds, to apologize, to make amends for daring to defy them. Daniel's chest tightened, his voice low but steady as he replied, "You don't understand her. You never wanted to. My mother is the reason I've ever had anything, and you treated her like she was nothing." Isabella scoffed, her tone dripping with disdain. "Because she is nothing, Daniel. She is a burden. She is the past. We are the future. Do you want to live chained to her farm, to her simple ways forever, or do you want to stand beside me where you belong?" In that moment, the illusion shattered completely. Daniel saw the truth with painful clarity. Isabella did not love him, not in the way his mother had loved him unconditionally, not in the way true love was meant to build, support, and uplift. She loved only the idea of control, of bending him to her will, of stripping away the very roots that had given him strength, and he realized with a bitterness that cut deep that he had almost allowed her to succeed. He had nearly lost his mother, the one person who had never wavered, never abandoned him, never demanded anything in return for her endless sacrifices. The days that followed were filled with growing distance. Daniel no longer rushed to soothe Isabella's outbursts. He no longer defended her sharp remarks. Instead, he grew quiet, reflective, his thoughts consumed by the farmhouse he had neglected, by the woman who still sat there with the same quiet strength she had always carried. Each morning he woke in the Hayes mansion felt heavier, as though the air itself rejected his presence. Each night he lay awake, haunted by his mother's voice, by her warning that one day he would regret his silence. He felt that regret now in every breath, and it gnawed at him like a wound that refused to heal. Meanwhile, Evelyn kept to her routines, though her body felt more weary than usual. She carried bales of hay to the barn, her arms aching, her back protesting with every step. She mended fences, her mind drifting to the boy who had once run alongside her in those fields, chasing grasshoppers and laughing under the summer sun. She cooked her meals in silence, setting only one plate where once she had dreamed of setting 2 or 3. She prayed at night, asking for strength not to give in to bitterness, asking for guidance on how to let go of the pain. Yet even in her prayers she felt the wound of her son's betrayal, and it weighed on her like a stone she could not set down. It was Clara who noticed the change in Daniel first. She saw him in town, his shoulders hunched, his eyes shadowed. He bought groceries without Isabella at his side, and when neighbors greeted him he offered only curt nods. The fire that once lit his presence was gone, replaced by a heaviness that seemed to drag him down with every step. Clara told Evelyn as much, but Evelyn only sighed, refusing to let herself hope too much. She had learned that hope was dangerous when disappointment came so often. Still, she could not stop her heart from aching at the thought that perhaps her son was finally beginning to see the truth. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in shades of amber and rose, Daniel drove down the familiar dirt road that led to the farmhouse. His truck slowed as he approached, memories rushing back with every creak of the tires on the gravel. He saw the porch where he had once sat with his mother, sipping lemonade after long summer days. He saw the window where her lamp always glowed late into the night as she worked or prayed. He parked the truck and sat there for a long time staring, unsure if he had the right to walk through that door again. His chest tightened with shame, with guilt, with the fear that she would not welcome him. And yet, beneath it all, a longing greater than his pride pushed him forward. Inside, Evelyn sat by the fire, mending a torn shirt with slow, deliberate stitches. She looked up as the knock came, her heart skipping a beat when she saw his figure through the window. For a moment she did not move, fear and longing warring within her, but then she rose, opening the door, her eyes meeting his. Daniel stood there, rain-soaked from a sudden summer shower, his face pale, his eyes filled with something she had not seen in years. Humility, raw and unguarded. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words faltered, and instead he dropped his gaze. "Mother," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I was wrong." And in that instant, though the pain was far from healed, Evelyn felt the first crack in the wall of silence that had stood between them. The illusion had shattered, and in the ruins of his choices, Daniel was finally beginning to see the truth. The healing and rebirth. The silence after Daniel's words lingered like a sacred hush, the kind that follows a confession too heavy for the heart to bear. Evelyn stood in the doorway, her hands trembling though her face remained calm, her eyes searching her son's as though she could read his soul. For so long she had prayed for this moment, prayed that he would see through the illusions of wealth and control, prayed that he would remember the bond that no one could sever. Now here he stood, his head bowed, his voice cracking under the weight of guilt, and though anger had fueled her for weeks, she felt something deeper stirring inside her, the ache of a mother who longed to hold her child again. She did not speak right away. She let the silence sit between them, heavy and meaningful, until finally she stepped aside and said softly, "Come in, Daniel." He entered the old farmhouse slowly, as though each step reminded him of the years he had turned away from it. His eyes scanned the room, the worn wooden table where he had once drawn pictures with stubby crayons, the rocking chair where his mother had read to him by lamplight, the mantel lined with small keepsakes from a life of endurance and quiet pride. It all came rushing back to him, and he realized with painful clarity that this was home, that no mansion, no polished halls, no glittering chandeliers could ever replace the warmth and truth of this place. Evelyn returned to her seat by the fire, her needle and thread still resting on the fabric she had been mending, and Daniel lowered himself into the chair opposite, his hands clasped tightly, his knuckles pale with the effort to contain his emotions. "Mother," he began again, his voice low but steady now, "I failed you. I stood silent when I should have spoken. I let her treat you as though you were nothing, when you are the reason I have ever been anything at all. I let her strip me of my strength, and I turned my back on the one person who never once turned her back on me. I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I need to ask for it anyway." His words cracked in the middle, his eyes shining with unshed tears, and in that moment he looked less like the man of 30 years and more like the boy who had once run into her arms after scraping his knees in the fields. Evelyn listened quietly, her heart breaking and healing all at once. She wanted to remind him of the pain he had caused, of the humiliation she had endured, of the nights she had wept in silence while he stood by another woman's side. But love has a way of softening even the hardest truths, and Evelyn's love for her son was deeper than the wounds of betrayal. She reached across the table, her hand weathered from years of labor, and laid it gently over his. "Daniel," she said, her voice firm but tender, "you are my son. You will always be my son. I have carried you through storms before, and I will carry you through this one too. But you must learn. You must never again allow anyone to make you forget where you came from, or who stood by you when you had nothing." Daniel bowed his head, her words cutting deeper than any rebuke, because they were not filled with anger, but with truth. Over the next days, Daniel returned to the farmhouse often, each visit a small step toward mending the bond he had nearly destroyed. He helped with the chores, his hands clumsy at first but growing steadier with each passing morning as he shoveled hay, fixed fences, and milked cows alongside his mother. In those moments he remembered the strength of honest work, the grounding peace of sweat earned by labor, the rhythm of life far from the shallow glamour of Isabella's world. And with each task he found pieces of himself that he had forgotten, the resilience his mother had taught him, the humility she had instilled, the pride in simple, honest living. Isabella, however, did not take kindly to his absence. She arrived at the farmhouse one afternoon, her heels sinking into the dirt, her voice sharp as she demanded he return with her. Her anger filled the quiet air like poison, her accusations spilling without pause. "You're throwing everything away, Daniel," she hissed, her eyes flashing. "All because of her. That woman has poisoned you against me. Don't you see? Without me, you are nothing. You'll be stuck here, rotting on this farm just like her." Evelyn stood silently on the porch, her expression calm, though her heart ached at hearing such venom spoken aloud. Daniel, however, no longer flinched. He straightened his shoulders and looked at Isabella with a clarity she had never seen in his eyes before. "You are wrong," he said firmly, his voice steady as stone. "It is because of her that I am anything at all. She gave me everything, her time, her strength, her future. You tried to cut me off from her to make me forget the very ground I stand on. But I won't forget anymore. You wanted me to choose Isabella, and now I have. I choose my mother. I choose the truth. I choose the life that was built on sacrifice and love, not arrogance and control." Isabella's face twisted in fury, her words catching in her throat as she realized the grip she had once held was slipping beyond recovery. She turned sharply, her footsteps crunching against the gravel as she stormed back to her car, leaving behind only the echo of her anger. Daniel watched her go, his chest rising and falling heavily, but he felt no regret. For the first time in years, he felt free. That evening, Daniel and Evelyn sat together on the porch watching the sunset stretch across the fields. The sky was painted in hues of gold and crimson, as though the heavens themselves were marking the beginning of something new. Daniel turned to his mother, his voice soft but filled with conviction. "I don't know what comes next. I don't know how to fix everything I've broken. But I do know this. I will never again let anyone take me from you. You are my family. You are my foundation. And I will spend the rest of my life proving that I remember." Evelyn's eyes glistened, her lips curving into a small, weary smile. She rested her hand on his, her heart finally allowing the tears it had held back for so long. "That's all I ever wanted, Daniel. Not riches, not recognition. Just to know that you remember." Word spread quickly through town of Isabella's departure, of Daniel's return to his mother's side, and the whispers that once carried judgment now carried respect. People spoke of Evelyn's quiet strength, of her dignity in the face of humiliation, of her courage to act when others would have stayed silent. She became, in the eyes of many, a symbol of resilience, a reminder that no wealth or status could erase the power of sacrifice and love. As weeks turned into months, Daniel began to rebuild his life. He worked alongside his mother on the farm, his hands growing calloused once more, his spirit stronger with each passing day. The farmhouse, once heavy with silence, now rang with conversation and laughter again. Evelyn, though older and weary from years of labor, found new energy in the presence of her son's renewed devotion. And together they healed, not by erasing the past, but by walking through it hand in hand, leaving behind the bitterness while holding fast to the lessons it had carved into their hearts. In the end, the story of Evelyn and Daniel became more than just the tale of a wedding gone wrong. It became a story whispered at church gatherings, told around dinner tables, shared among neighbors with reverence. It was the story of a mother's unyielding love, of the dignity that cannot be bought or erased, of a son who nearly lost everything before finally remembering the truth. And it carried within it a lesson for everyone who heard, that respect for those who sacrifice for us is not optional, that arrogance crumbles in the face of resilience, and that love rooted in humility will outlast any illusion of wealth or control. On a warm evening months later, as Evelyn rocked gently on her porch with Jasper at her feet and Daniel working in the fields beyond, she looked up at the stars scattered across the sky. She remembered telling her son once that stars were like promises, constant and unchanging no matter how dark the night became. And now, as she listened to the sound of her son's laughter drifting across the fields, she knew that promise had held true. She whispered softly to herself, a prayer of gratitude and hope. "We lost much, but we found what matters, and that is enough."